The grand hallways of Kane Industries echoed with Dorian Kane's angry footsteps. At 35, he was handsome, rich, and absolutely furious. His father had just dropped a bomb on him. He had to marry Victoria Sterling within 3 months, or he'd lose his place in the company. "You can't do this to me," Dorian shouted, slamming his hand on his father's expensive desk. "I'm not some puppet you can control." Richard Kane, a man whose grey hair and stern face showed his 60 years of life, didn't even flinch. "The merger with Sterling Industries depends on this marriage. You've had your fun, son. It's time to grow up." Dorian stormed out of the office, loosening his tie as he walked. The spring air hit his face as he stepped onto the busy New York street. He needed a drink, and he needed it now. At O'Malley's bar just a few blocks away, he ordered his third whiskey. The afternoon crowd was thin, just a few regulars and a woman in shabby clothes sitting at the far end of the bar. She caught his attention because she seemed out of place. Despite her worn-out coat and messy hair, she sat with perfect posture and sipped water with surprising elegance. "Another one," Dorian called to the bartender, his mind racing with ways to escape this. Arranged marriage. His father had always controlled his life, deciding his school, his career, and now this. He was sick of it. The woman in the shabby clothes got up to leave, but she stumbled. Without thinking, Dorian reached out to steady her. Their eyes met, and for a moment he was struck by how blue they were. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice cultured despite her appearance, and that's when the idea hit him. It was crazy, reckless, and absolutely perfect. "Wait," he called out. "Would you like to make some money?" The woman turned, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Excuse me?" "I need a wife," Dorian said, the alcohol making him bold. "A temporary one, just long enough to get my family off my back. I'll pay you well." She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You're drunk. I'm serious, $5 million. All you have to do is marry me and play the part for a year. Then we divorce, you get the money, and I get my freedom." The woman stared at him for a long moment. Something flickered in her eyes. Was it desperation? Calculation? "You're insane," she said, but she didn't walk away. "I'm rich and I'm desperate," Dorian replied. "What do you say? Want to be Mrs. Kane for a year?" She glanced around the bar, then back at him. "You don't even know my name. So tell me." "Celeste," she said after a pause. "Celeste Smith." He didn't notice her hesitation over the last name. He was too busy waving the bartender over. "We need to celebrate. My new fiancé and I are getting married today." What Dorian didn't know was that across town, in a penthouse office with a view of Central Park, Gregory Montgomery was staring at a photograph. It showed a younger version of the woman from the bar, dressed in designer clothes, her blue eyes sparkling with joy. The headline below read, "Montgomery heiress still missing after 3 years. "Sir," his assistant said, entering the office. "We might have found her." Gregory Montgomery smiled, but it wasn't a kind expression. "Finally," he said, touching the photograph. "It's time to come home, Celeste." Back at the bar, Dorian was already dragging Celeste toward the exit. "The courthouse closes in an hour. We can still make it." "Wait," Celeste said, pulling back. "Don't you want a prenup or something?" Dorian laughed. "You're a beggar. What could you possibly take from me?" Those words would come back to haunt him sooner than he knew, because while Celeste looked like she had nothing, she was actually worth billions, and she was about to turn Dorian's simple plan for revenge into something far more complicated. In the taxi to the courthouse, Celeste's mind raced. She had spent 3 years hiding from her past, working odd jobs, sleeping in cheap rooms, doing whatever it took to stay invisible. Now, in one crazy moment, she was about to step back into the spotlight in the worst possible way. But she was desperate. Her money was running out and she needed a new identity, a new protection. Maybe being Mrs. Kane could give her that. What she didn't count on was how her heart would race when Dorian took her hand to slide on the cheap ring they bought from a street vendor. She didn't expect the warmth that spread through her when he smiled at her, drunk and happy with his plan. And she certainly didn't expect to feel guilty about the lies she was already telling him. The ceremony was quick and basic. The witness was a janitor they pulled from the hallway. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Dorian surprised them both by pulling her into a kiss. It was brief, but it left Celeste breathless and terrified. Because for just a moment, she forgot this was all pretend. "Ready to meet the family, Mrs. Kane?" Dorian asked as they left the courthouse. Celeste clutched her purse, which contained her only belongings, including a burner phone with one saved number for emergencies. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, trying to smile. What neither of them knew was that their impulsive marriage was about to shake New York society to its core, expose dangerous secrets, and force them both to answer one crucial question. What happens when a marriage of convenience turns into something real and potentially deadly? The Kane mansion stood like a castle against the evening sky. Celeste looked up at it through the car window, her heart pounding. In her old life, she'd been to plenty of houses like this. But now, dressed in her thrift store clothes, she felt like an imposter. "Remember the story," Dorian said, parking his sports car. The afternoon's drinks had worn off, replaced by determination. "We met 3 months ago at a charity event. It was love at first sight." "Won't people check?" Celeste asked. "There must be guest lists, photographs." "Nobody will look too closely at a nobody," he said, not noticing how she flinched at his words. "Just stay quiet and let me do the talking." Inside, the mansion buzzed with activity. Richard Kane stood at the foot of the grand staircase, his face turning purple when he saw them. Next to him, Victoria Sterling, Dorian's intended bride, looked ready to explode. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded. Dorian wrapped his arm around Celeste's waist, pulling her close. "Father, meet my wife. We got married this afternoon." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand crushed her champagne glass. "You're what?" "Darling," Richard's wife Margaret hurried forward, her social training kicking in despite the shock. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private." But Dorian was on a roll. "Nothing to discuss. I'm a married man now. The merger will have to find another way." "You fool." Richard grabbed Dorian's arm, pulling him aside. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" While father and son argued in heated whispers, Victoria circled Celeste like a shark. "And who exactly are you?" "Celeste Smith," she answered, using the name she'd chosen years ago when she first disappeared. "Smith?" Victoria sneered. "How common. And what does your family do?" Before Celeste could answer, a new voice joined the conversation. "Yes, I'd love to hear about your family too." Everyone turned. An elegant man in his 60s stood in the doorway, his silver hair perfectly styled. Celeste's blood ran cold. It was Charles Sterling, Victoria's father, and her father's oldest friend. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Celeste saw recognition flicker in his face. But then it passed, replaced by a calculating look that frightened her even more. "This is a disaster," Richard was saying. "The press will have a field day, a nobody, a beggar." "She's my wife," Dorian snapped, and something in his voice made Celeste turn to look at him. He seemed different suddenly, protective almost. "Not for long," Victoria hissed. "I'll have my lawyers—" "You'll do nothing," Charles interrupted smoothly. "If Dorian has married—" what was it? Celeste? Then we should welcome her to the family. Everyone stared at him in shock. Charles Sterling was known for his ruthless business tactics. This easy acceptance was unexpected and suspicious. "But, Daddy," Victoria started. "Hush, dear." Charles smiled at Celeste, making her skin crawl. "I'm sure Mrs. Kane will be a fascinating addition to our circle. In fact, I insist you both come to dinner tomorrow night, at my house." Celeste wanted to run. Charles Sterling's house was the last place she should go, but Dorian was already accepting, too relieved by this apparent acceptance to notice anything strange. Later that night, in Dorian's penthouse apartment, Celeste paced the guest room he'd given her. She needed to leave. Charles would expose her, or worse, tell her father where she was. But leaving meant losing the protection being Mrs. Kane could provide. Her burner phone buzzed, a text from her only contact. "They know, run." A knock on her door made her jump. It was Dorian, looking uncomfortable in his casual clothes. "Look, I know this is weird, but thank you. You were great. Tonight." Celeste tried to smile, hiding the phone behind her back. "It's fine, but your father—" "Forget him, he'll come around." And with Charles Sterling's support, even Victoria can't cause trouble. He ran a hand through his hair. You know, when I'm not drunk, you're actually kind of beautiful. The compliment hit her like a punch, because despite everything, despite all her plans and lies, her heart skipped a beat when he smiled at her. Dorian, she started, not sure what she was going to say. But then his phone rang. It's my brother, he said, checking the screen. Probably. Calling to yell at me, too. Get some sleep, wife. Tomorrow's going to be interesting. After he left, Celeste sank onto the bed, her mind racing. She had 24 hours before dinner at the Sterlings. 24 hours to decide, should she run again or stay and risk everything for a man who had no idea who she really was? In his study across town, Charles Sterling poured himself a drink and picked up his phone. Greg? Yes, it's Charles. You'll never guess who just married Dorian Kane. Your daughter's alive, and she's just made a very big mistake. Morning came. Too soon at Dorian's penthouse. Celeste woke up to the sound of voices in the living room. She recognized Dorian's, but the other was unfamiliar, deep and angry. Are you completely insane? The stranger was saying. A woman off the street? What were you thinking? Good morning, brother, Dorian replied, sounding tired. Would you like to yell a little louder? I don't think the doorman heard you yet. Celeste crept closer to her door. Listening. This must be Marcus Kane, Dorian's older brother. She'd heard about him. The responsible one, the perfect son. This isn't a joke, Dorian. That woman could be anyone, a gold digger, a con artist. She's my wife, Dorian said firmly. And she's staying. We'll see about that. I've already called. Our investigators. Celeste's heart stopped. Investigators. She had to get out now. She was throwing her few belongings into her purse when there was a knock at her door. Celeste, are you awake? We need to go shopping. Shopping? She opened the door to find Dorian holding a credit card. You can't go to dinner at the Sterlings dressed like that. Buy whatever you need. 2 hours later, Celeste stood in an expensive boutique surrounded by designer dresses. The saleswoman who had initially looked at her with disdain was now fawning. Over her thanks to Dorian's platinum card. The blue one, Dorian said suddenly. He'd insisted on coming along, claiming he needed to make sure she looked the part. It matches your eyes. The dress was beautiful, and eerily similar to one she'd worn in her old life. She turned away, blinking back tears. It's too much. Nothing's too much for Mrs. Kane, he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him. He was watching her with an odd expression, like he was trying to figure something out. Why did you really marry me? She asked quietly. You know why? To spite my father? No, she shook her head. Why me? There must have been other women in that bar. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He checked it and frowned. It's Marcus again. Get the dress. I'll meet you at the register. That evening, as their car pulled up to the Sterling mansion, Celeste felt sick. She'd spent 3 years avoiding places like this, people like this. Now, here she was, walking straight into the lion's den. Charles Sterling greeted them at the door himself. The happy couple. Celeste, you look familiar. Have we met before? I don't think so, she said quickly. Too quickly. Inside, the dining room gleamed with crystal and silver. Victoria was there, along with Marcus Kane and his wife. The tension was thick enough to cut with the expensive butter knives. So, Celeste, Charles said as the first course was served, tell us about your family. They're dead, she said flatly, using the lie she'd practiced for years. It's just me. How convenient, Victoria muttered. Now, Charles smiled. We all have secrets, don't we? For instance, did you know, Dorian, that there's a fascinating mystery in New York society? The disappearance of Celeste Montgomery. Celeste's spoon clattered against her plate. Dorian looked confused. Who? The Montgomery heiress. Vanished 3 years ago, leaving behind a fortune worth billions. Some say she's dead. Others say she's hiding. Charles's eyes locked onto Celeste. She had the most striking blue eyes. Just like yours, my dear. How interesting, Celeste managed to say, her heart pounding. Very. In fact, I have an old photo. Charles reached into his jacket. Suddenly, the lights went out. In the darkness, someone screamed. When the lights came back on seconds later, Charles was staring at an empty chair. Celeste was gone. What the hell? Dorian stood up. Where's my wife? But Celeste was already running through the garden, her heels sinking into the wet grass. She'd planned this escape route the moment they arrived. Old habits died hard. Behind her, she heard voices calling her name. Dorian's voice. She wanted to stop to explain, but she couldn't, because now they'd all know. The investigators would find out everything, and when they did, both she and Dorian would be in danger. Her burner phone buzzed as she reached the street. Another message. Get out now, your father knows. She hailed a taxi, her hands shaking. The airport, she said, then looked back at the mansion. Through an upstairs window, she saw Dorian's silhouette, searching for her. I'm sorry, she whispered, because in just one day she'd done the one thing she'd promised herself she'd never do. She'd started to care. Dorian spent the night driving through New York, searching for Celeste. His phone kept ringing. Marcus, his father, even Victoria. But he ignored them all. His mind was racing with questions. Who was Celeste Montgomery? And why did his chest hurt when he thought about Celeste? His Celeste running away. At dawn, he finally returned to his penthouse. The door was unlocked. Inside, Charles Sterling sat in his favorite chair, looking completely at home. How did you get in here? Dorian demanded. Your doorman knows me. Charles held up a thick folder. We need to talk about your wife. Ex-wife soon enough, Marcus said, stepping out of the shadows. The lawyers are already working on it. Dorian snatched the folder from Charles's hand. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Celeste at charity galas, Celeste at society events, Celeste standing next to Gregory Montgomery, one of the richest men in America. Celeste Montgomery, Charles said smoothly. Only daughter of Gregory Montgomery, heir to the Montgomery fortune, and my goddaughter. Dorian sank onto the couch. Why did she run away? That's the interesting part. Charles smiled coldly. 3 years ago, she discovered something that could destroy both our families. Instead of using it, she disappeared. We've been looking for her ever since. What did she discover? That's not your concern. What matters is getting this marriage annulled before... No. Dorian stood up. I want to hear it from her. Don't be stupid, Marcus snapped. She's a liar. She used you. Maybe she had. But Dorian couldn't forget the way she'd looked at him in the boutique, the vulnerability in her eyes when she'd asked why he'd chosen her. There was more to this story. Across town, in a cheap motel room, Celeste was packing again. She'd done this so many times before. Grab essentials, leave everything else, disappear. But this time was different. This time her hands kept shaking, her phone buzzed, not the burner phone, her new one. Dorian's number flashed on the screen. After 5 rings, she answered. Don't hang up, he said quickly. Please. I can't talk to you. Then just listen. I know who you are, Celeste Montgomery. I know you're rich, probably richer than me, so you weren't after my money. Tell me why. Why did you agree to marry me? Tears rolled down her face. I needed protection, a new identity, being Mrs. Kane. It seemed perfect. Protection from what? She closed her eyes. Dorian, if I tell you, you'll be in danger. Too. I'm already in danger, aren't I? Charles Sterling is sitting in my living room right now. Your father's probably on his way. Whatever this is, let me help. You can't. Try me. She took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I found documents. Proof that Sterling Industries and Kane Enterprises weren't just companies. They were fronts. Your father, Charles Sterling, my father, they've been laundering money for years. Billions of dollars. And when I threatened to expose them, they tried to kill you. Dorian finished, his voice hard. They made it look like an accident. If my security guard hadn't warned me... She wiped her eyes. I've been running ever since. Where are you? I can't tell you that. Celeste, please. You're my wife. She laughed bitterly. A wife you married to spite your father. Maybe at first. But now... He paused. I'm parked outside the Red Moon Motel, room 115, right? Her heart stopped. She ran to the window and pulled back the curtain. There he was, leaning against his car, phone to his ear. How Did you find me? You used my credit card to buy that dress. The receipt had your signature, your real signature, Celeste Montgomery's signature. I have a good memory for details. He looked up at her window. Come home. We'll fight them together. They'll kill us both. Let them try. His voice softened. You know what's funny? When I walked into that bar, I was looking for a way to destroy my father's plans. Instead, I found someone worth fighting for. Celeste pressed her forehead against the cold glass. This isn't a fairy tale, Dorian. The bad guys don't just give up. No, but sometimes they lose. I have proof too. Records of every illegal deal Marcus has made since he took over the company's finances. We can expose them all. Her hand tightened on the phone. Why would you do that? It would destroy your family. Maybe it's time for both our families to face justice. He straightened up. I'm coming up. You can either run again or you can stay and fight. But I'm hoping you'll stay, because I think I'm falling in love with my wife. Celeste opened the motel room door before Dorian could knock. They stared at each other for a long moment, both aware that everything had changed. We need to move fast, Dorian said, entering the room. Charles is probably already tracking my car. I have a safe house, Celeste replied, grabbing her bag, but we'll need to ditch your phone. They can trace it. As if on cue, Dorian's phone rang. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. Dorian answered, putting it on speaker. Where are you? Marcus demanded. Taking a drive, thinking about my marriage. Your marriage is over. Father wants to see you. Now. Tell him I'll be there in an hour. Dorian hung up and smashed the phone. Under his heel. They took a taxi to Queens, where Celeste led them to a rundown apartment building. Inside one of the units, she pulled out a laptop from a hidden compartment in the wall. Everything's here, she said, typing quickly. Bank records, transfer documents, emails, enough to put them all away for life. Dorian watched her work, amazed by how different she seemed now. Confident, focused, no longer pretending to be helpless. Why didn't you go to the FBI? He asked. I tried. 2 days later, my contact was found dead in his apartment. Apparent suicide. She looked up at him. That's when I knew how far they'd go to keep this quiet. Then we'll go public. All of it. It's not that simple. These records implicate more than just our fathers. Politicians, judges, even some FBI officials. We'd need protection. I might know someone, Dorian said. My college roommate works for the U.S. Attorney's Office now. He's straight as an arrow and he hates my father. Before Celeste could respond, her burner phone buzzed. The message made her blood run cold. They found you. Run. Now. Seconds later, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy footsteps, multiple people. Fire escape, Celeste whispered, grabbing the laptop. They made it to the window just as the door burst open. 2 men in dark suits entered, guns drawn. But Celeste and Dorian were already climbing down the metal stairs. Stop! One of the men shouted. A bullet pinged off the railing near Dorian's head. They ran through back alleys, the sound of pursuit close behind. Celeste led them to a busy street, where she suddenly pulled Dorian into a crowded restaurant. Through the kitchen, she said, moving with the confidence of someone who'd planned this route before. The kitchen staff barely looked up as they rushed through. They emerged in another alley where a black car was waiting. Get in, said the driver. An older man Celeste seemed to know. Frank's been helping me stay hidden, she explained as they sped away. He was my father's driver for 20 years until he discovered what was really going on. Where are we going? Dorian asked. To see your friend at the U.S. Attorney's Office, Celeste said. But first, she pulled out her laptop and started typing again. I'm sending copies of everything to every major news outlet. Even if something happens to us, the truth will come out. Dorian took her hand. I won't let anything happen to you. She smiled sadly. You can't promise that. But thank you for trying. She squeezed his hand. You know, when you found me in that bar, I thought you were just another spoiled rich boy throwing a tantrum. And now I think maybe fate brought us together, the only 2 people willing to stand up to our families. Plus, Dorian said, with a grin, you have to admit I'm growing on you. Before she could answer, Frank's voice came from the front seat. We've got company. Black SUV, 2 cars back. Celeste looked in the side mirror. "It's my father's security team. They'll try to force us off the road. Not if I can help it," Frank said, making a sharp turn that threw them against each other. The chase was on. Through the streets of New York they went, Frank's years of experience showing in every move he made. But their pursuers were professionals. "Two. Hold on," Frank called out, then spun the wheel hard. The car skidded, tires screaming. For a moment, they were airborne. Then they crashed through a construction barrier and down into an underground parking garage. "Everyone out," Frank ordered. "There's a service exit on the other side. Go, I'll hold them off." "Frank, no," Celeste started. "I've lived a long life, Miss Montgomery. Now go. Make them pay for everything they've done." Dorian pulled Celeste from the car, just as the SUV's headlights appeared at the garage entrance. They ran toward the service door, the sound of screeching tires and gunshots echoing behind them. "Frank," Celeste whispered, tears in her eyes. "He gave us a chance," Dorian said gently. "Let's not waste it." They emerged onto a quiet street, both breathing hard. In the distance, sirens wailed. "Your friend in the U.S. Attorney's office," Celeste said. "How fast can he get here?" Dorian pulled out the burner phone she'd given him earlier. "Let's find out. Because one way or another, this ends tonight." Dorian's friend James Parker worked late at the U.S. Attorney's office. When they arrived, he was the only one left on his floor. "You look terrible," James said, taking in their dirty clothes and wild eyes. "Both of you." "We need protection," Dorian said. "And we have evidence of massive financial crimes." James locked his office door. "Show me." Celeste opened her laptop. For the next hour, they walked James through everything. The money laundering, the murders, the cover-ups. "This is bigger than big," James said, rubbing his eyes. "We're talking about some of the most powerful people in New York. Can you help?" "Us?" Celeste asked. "I can get you into witness protection tonight, but first—" He was cut off by the sound of the elevator dinging. "It's after midnight," James said slowly. "Nobody else should be here." They turned off the lights and crouched behind James's desk. Footsteps approached, multiple sets. "Check every office," a familiar voice ordered. "Charles Sterling, how did they find us?" Dorian whispered. James pointed to Celeste's laptop. "They probably tracked the IP address when you sent those emails." The footsteps got closer. James pulled out his phone and started typing rapidly. "What are you doing?" Celeste asked. "Calling in the cavalry." The office door handle jiggled. Then came the sound of a key in the lock. "The security guard," James muttered. "They must have gotten to him." The door opened. Light flooded in. "Well, well," Charles Sterling said, stepping into the office. Behind him stood Gregory Montgomery, Celeste's father. Both men held guns. "Celeste," Gregory said softly, "you've caused quite enough trouble." "It's over, Father." Celeste stood up, her voice steady. "The evidence is already out there." "You mean these emails?" Charles held up his phone. "Our tech team intercepted them all. Nothing got through." Dorian moved to stand beside Celeste. "You can't kill everyone. Someone will talk eventually." "Kill you?" Gregory laughed. "No, sweetheart. You're both going to a private hospital. Severe mental breakdown, such a tragedy. You'll get the best. Care for as long as necessary." "You mean you'll drug us until we can't think straight?" Celeste said bitterly. "It's for your own good." Gregory stepped forward. "You're sick, Celeste. You've been sick ever since your mother died." "Don't you dare talk about Mom," Celeste snapped. "She killed herself because she found out what you really were." James slowly reached for his desk drawer, but Charles saw the movement. "Hands where I can see them, Mr. Parker." "It's funny," Charles said, "how things work out. Dorian, you wanted to rebel against your father? Well, congratulations. You've destroyed your family's legacy." "So you destroyed it," Dorian replied, "when you turned our companies into criminal enterprises." Suddenly, sirens wailed outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. "That's impossible," Charles said. "We control the police." "Not the FBI," James smiled. "And I texted them everything while we were hiding." Gregory raised his gun. "Then I guess we have nothing to lose. Drop your weapons." A dozen FBI agents burst through the door, guns drawn. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Gregory turned his gun toward Celeste. Dorian leaped forward, pushing her out of the way. 2 shots rang out. When Celeste opened her eyes, both Charles and her father were in handcuffs, and Dorian was on the floor, blood spreading across his shirt. "No, no, no," she cradled his head in her lap. "Stay with me, please." His eyes fluttered open. "Are you okay?" "You idiot," she sobbed. "Why did you do that?" "Because," he coughed, "I really did fall in love with my wife." The paramedics rushed in. As they loaded Dorian onto a stretcher, Celeste held his hand tight. "Don't you dare die on me," she whispered. "We have too much left to do." "Like what?" he managed to ask. "Like having a real wedding, one where I'm wearing white instead of thrift store clothes." He smiled weakly. "Is that a proposal, Mrs. Kane?" "That's a promise." The ambulance doors closed and they sped off into the night. Behind them, the FBI led Charles Sterling and Gregory Montgomery through a crowd of reporters. Their empire was crumbling, but Celeste didn't care. All that mattered was the man holding her hand, fighting for his life. 2 weeks passed at New York General Hospital. Dorian survived the surgery, but remained in critical condition. Celeste never left his side, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair and living on hospital coffee. Victoria showed up once, wearing designer black like a widow. "I hope you're happy," she spat at Celeste. "You've ruined everything." "The only thing ruined is your father's criminal empire," Celeste replied without looking up from Dorian's hand, which she held tightly. Marcus came every day, torn between anger at the scandal and worry for his brother. He'd been cleared of involvement. In the crimes, he really hadn't known what his father was doing. "The company's stock is worthless," he told Celeste one evening. "Everything our family built, then build something better," she said. "Something honest." The news was full of the scandal. Charles Sterling and Gregory Montgomery's arrests had exposed decades of corruption. More arrests followed: judges, politicians, business leaders. The whole rotten system was falling apart. One morning, Celeste woke to find Dorian watching her. "You look terrible," he whispered. She laughed through her tears. "You try sleeping in a hospital chair for 2 weeks. Why didn't you go home?" "Because home is wherever you are." She touched his face. "Even if it's a hospital room." He tried to sit up but winced. "Did they get them? My father? Yours? They're all in jail. No bail. Too much risk they'd flee the country." She helped him sip some water. The evidence was overwhelming once the FBI got involved. And the companies? In chaos. But Marcus is trying to save what he can. He's working with the authorities, separating the legitimate business from the criminal operations. Dorian closed his eyes. "I keep thinking about that day in the bar. How crazy I was to marry a stranger." "You weren't crazy," Celeste said softly. "You were brave. You did what I never could, stood up to your family openly. I did it to make them angry. But then I fell in love with my fake wife, who turned out to be real after all." A nurse came in to check his vitals. "Much better today, Mr. Kane. The doctor thinks you can go home next week." After she left, Dorian turned to Celeste. "Where is home now?" "Both our houses are probably crawling with FBI agents. I have a small apartment in Brooklyn. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe." "A billionaire heiress in Brooklyn?" "Former billionaire," she corrected. "Most of the Montgomery fortune was dirty money. It's all been frozen. Same with the Kane fortune." He squeezed her hand. "We might actually have to work for a living." "Shocking," she smiled. "Good thing I have experience being poor." "About that?" He shifted uncomfortably. "All those months you spent running, hiding, working awful jobs. I'm so sorry." "Don't be. It taught me what really matters." She leaned in and kissed him gently. "And it led me to you." A week later, they moved into Celeste's Brooklyn apartment. It was tiny compared to their old homes, but it felt more real somehow. More honest. They watched the trials unfold on TV. Richard Kane, Charles Sterling, and Gregory Montgomery all pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences. The evidence was too strong to fight. 30 years, Dorian said when his father's sentence was announced. "He'll be an old man when he gets out." "Are you okay?" Celeste asked. "I don't know. He was a terrible father, but he was still your father." She understood perfectly. She felt the same way about her own father. That night they sat on their small balcony, looking at the Brooklyn Bridge in the distance. The city felt different now, cleaner somehow, despite the scandal. "What do we do now?" Celeste asked. "We're broke, unemployed, and our names are mud in New York society. Now?" Dorian pulled her close. "Now we live, for real this time. No more pretending, no more lies. You still want to be married to me? Even without the money and status? I want to be married to you because you're brave and strong, and you make me want to be better." He kissed her forehead. The money never mattered. "Good," she smiled. "Because I have a confession. I applied for a job today." "You did? Where?" "A small investment firm in Manhattan. They need someone who knows how to spot financial fraud. Turns out growing up around white-collar criminals gives you a unique skill set." Dorian laughed. "My wife, the fraud investigator. I love it." Then he grew serious. "I've been thinking about work too. What if we started our own company, something small but honest? Use what we know to help other companies stay clean. Mr. and Mrs. Kane, financial ethics consultants? Why not? We've seen firsthand what corruption does to families, to society. Maybe we can help prevent it." Celeste looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, when I married you, I thought it was just for protection, a way to hide. And now? Now I think it was the first honest thing either of us had done in years." 6 months passed. Celeste and Dorian's tiny consulting firm was starting to make a name for itself. They specialized in helping small companies set up anti-fraud measures, and word was spreading about their expertise. One morning, Marcus showed up at their office, a converted warehouse space they shared with 3 other startups. The board wants you back, Dorian, he said without preamble. Both of you, actually. They think having the whistleblowers in charge would restore public trust. Dorian looked at Celeste across their shared desk. She shook her head slightly. "No thanks," Dorian told his brother. "We're doing good work here." "This is crazy," Marcus exploded. "You're working in a warehouse, eating lunch from food trucks. This isn't who we are." "Maybe it's who we should have been all along," Dorian replied. After Marcus left, Celeste found Dorian on the roof, staring at the Manhattan skyline. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The penthouse, the parties, the power?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remember the cost, the lies, the crimes, the constant fear of getting caught." He pulled her close. "This is better. It's real." Their moment was interrupted by Celeste's phone. The caller ID showed the prison. "Hello, Father," she said, putting it on speaker. "I'm being released," Gregory Montgomery said without greeting. "Good behavior, overcrowding." The lawyers worked it out. Celeste's hand tightened on Dorian's. "When?" "Next week. I want to see you." "Why?" "Because you're my daughter, and because I have a proposition. The overseas accounts are the ones the FBI never found. I can tell you where they are." "You mean the stolen money?" "No thanks. It's yours by right. Hundreds of millions, Celeste. You could have your life back." "I have my life, Father. A good one, an honest one." "With him?" Gregory's voice dripped with disdain. Kane." "Yes, with him, my husband, the man who helped me stop you." "Think about it," Gregory pressed. "The money's clean now, untraceable. You could—" Celeste hung up. Her hands were shaking. "Hey," Dorian said softly. "It's okay. We knew they'd get out eventually." "What if he comes after us?" "Then we face him together, like we do everything else." That night they got another visitor at their small apartment. Victoria Sterling, looking uncomfortable in the Brooklyn walk-up. "Daddy's dying," she said, perching on their second-hand couch. "Cancer. He has maybe 6 months." "I'm sorry," Celeste said and meant it. "He wants to make things right. Confess to everything, including—" Victoria hesitated. "Including your mother's death." Celeste sat down hard. "What about my mother?" "It wasn't suicide. When she found out about the money laundering, she threatened to go public. Charles and your father—" Victoria couldn't finish. Dorian caught Celeste as her knees gave out. All these years, she'd blamed herself for not seeing her mother's depression, for not being there. "There's more," Victoria said. "The overseas accounts, they're in your name. Your mother set them up before she died, moving clean money, her inheritance, out of the company. It's yours, legally and morally." How much? Dorian asked. 50 million, not billions like before, but enough to make a difference, Celeste finished. She looked at Dorian. We could help so many people. Your ethics consulting firm, Victoria nodded. Turn it into something bigger. A foundation, maybe. After she left, Celeste and Dorian sat in silence for a long time. What are you thinking? He finally asked. I'm thinking about my mother. How she tried to fight them her way, protecting what she could. Celeste wiped her eyes. Maybe we can finish what she started. A foundation, Dorian mused. Teaching companies to spot fraud, helping whistleblowers, funding investigations, using dirty money to clean up Wall Street. Celeste smiled through her tears. Mom would have loved the irony. They stayed up all night planning. By morning, they had a new mission. The money wouldn't make them part of high society again, and they didn't want it to. Instead, it would fuel their fight against corruption. You know what this means? Dorian said as they watched the sunrise. We're going to make a lot of powerful people very nervous. Good, Celeste replied. They should be nervous, because this time we're not running. This time we're changing things. She looked at their tiny apartment, at the life they'd built from nothing. But we're keeping this place, right? Of course, he kissed her. It's home. Gregory Montgomery wasn't happy about his daughter's plans for the money. He showed up at their office unannounced, looking thinner after prison, but no less dangerous. A foundation? He sneered. You're throwing away your inheritance on strangers? I'm using it to fight people like you, Celeste said calmly. Now please leave before I call security. You ungrateful. He stepped toward her, but Dorian moved between them. That's enough, Dorian said. You lost the right to tell her what to do when you killed her mother. Gregory's face went white. Who told you? Charles Sterling confessed everything. His letter arrived this morning. Celeste held up an envelope. He's dying, Father, and he's telling the truth before he goes about everything. You can't prove anything. The police reopened Mom's case this morning. They're coming for you. As if on cue, sirens wailed outside the building. Gregory ran to the window. Police cars surrounded the entrance. Celeste, he said, suddenly looking old and afraid. Help me. I'm your father. My father died the day he murdered my mother. She pressed the intercom. Security, send them up. They watched as the police led Gregory away in handcuffs. This time he wouldn't get out early. That night, they received another visitor, Marcus, looking shaken. Did you see the news? Charles, Sterling's confession. Father knew about everything. The murder, the cover-up. Are you surprised? Dorian asked. No. Yes. I don't know. Marcus sank onto their couch. All those years I thought I was protecting the family legacy. But there was nothing left to protect, was there? Celeste brought him coffee. There's still time to build something new, something better. That's why I'm here. Marcus pulled out some papers. I want to help with the foundation, if you'll let me. Dorian and Celeste exchanged looks. They'd been discussing expanding their work, but needed someone who knew the banking system from the inside. It won't be glamorous, Dorian warned. No corner office, no expense account. Good, Marcus said. I'm tired of glamour. I want purpose. Over. The next few weeks, the Kane Montgomery Foundation for Financial Ethics took shape. They hired investigators, lawyers, and financial experts. Their first case was a small family business being pressured to launder money for a criminal organization. Just like how our fathers started, Celeste said as they prepared for court. One small business at a time, spreading the corruption. But we're stopping it, Dorian replied. One business at a time. The foundation's work attracted attention. Other whistleblowers came forward. More cases were exposed. They were making enemies, but also allies. One evening, Victoria called. Daddy's gone, she said. He left you a letter. Charles Sterling's. Last words were a full confession and an apology, not just for the financial crimes, but for destroying lives, families, trust. I didn't just steal money, he wrote. I stole innocence. From my daughter, from the Kane boys, from you, Celeste. Your mother was right. Some debts can never be repaid. But maybe you can prevent others from paying the price we did. Celeste read the letter on their balcony, tears falling. Dorian held her, understanding her pain. They'd both lost their families to greed, but found something more precious. Truth, purpose, and each other. The Foundation approved 10 new cases today, Dorian said softly. Small companies, honest people trying to resist pressure to break the law. Mom would be proud, Celeste whispered. She always said one person standing up for truth could change everything. She was right. Look at us. A fake marriage turned real. A fall from grace turned into redemption. Celeste turned in his arms. Speaking of marriage, remember when I promised you a real wedding? In the hospital? When you thought I was dying? I think it's time. Not a society wedding like before. Something small, honest, like us, he smiled. The reformed billionaires of Brooklyn. Exactly. Because all that running, all that fear and hiding, it led me to you, to this life. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Probably another arrest in the ongoing corruption investigation. But on their small balcony, Celeste and Dorian held each other, knowing they were exactly where they needed to be. The mighty had fallen, but from those ashes something new and better was rising. One case at a time, one truth at a time, they were changing their world, and they were doing it together. A year later, Celeste stood in front of a mirror in her old Brooklyn apartment. The wedding dress was simple, no designer label, no expensive frills, just like their new life. Ready? Victoria asked, adjusting Celeste's veil. The two former rivals had become unlikely friends, bonded by their shared determination to right their father's wrongs. The ceremony was in a small garden by the Brooklyn Bridge. No society photographers, no press, just friends who'd stood by them through everything. Marcus was Dorian's best man. He'd proven himself at the Foundation, working tirelessly to help other whistleblowers come forward. James Parker, the U.S. attorney who'd helped them that night, sat in the front row. Thanks to their work together, dozens of corrupt executives were now behind bars. Frank was there too. He'd survived the shooting in the parking garage and now headed the Foundation's security team. His proud smile reminded Celeste of her mother. When Dorian saw her walking down the aisle, his eyes filled with tears. This wasn't their first wedding, but it was their real one. A year ago, he said in his vows, I married you to spite my family. I was angry, drunk, and stupid, but it was the best mistake I ever made. You taught me that real love isn't about money or power. It's about standing together, fighting for what's right. Celeste's voice shook as she spoke. I married you for protection, thinking I had to hide who I was, but you showed me that being honest, being myself, was the greatest protection of all. You're not just my husband. You're my partner, my hero, my home. At the reception, held in their office warehouse, Marcus clinked his glass for a toast. When this all started, I thought Dorian had lost his mind. A billionaire marrying a beggar? It was a scandal. He smiled at Celeste. Turns out the beggar was a billionaire too, but more importantly, she was exactly what our family needed. Someone brave enough to fight for the truth. Victoria stood. Next. My father died thinking he'd lost everything, but watching you two building something good from all that pain, I realized he was wrong. Sometimes losing everything is how you find what really matters. Later, dancing in Dorian's arms, Celeste saw their guests mingling. Reformed executives with whistleblowers, lawyers with activists, all united in their mission to fight corruption. The Foundation approved funding for 20 new cases today, Dorian murmured in her ear. Small businesses fighting back against money laundering, workers exposing fraud. Just another day at the office, Celeste smiled. Speaking of office, he spun her gently. Marcus found something interesting in the old Kane Industries records, a pattern of payments to a senator who's been blocking financial reform. Honeymoon. We'll have to wait? Looks like it. He kissed her softly. Is that okay? More than okay. Fighting corruption with my husband? That's my idea of romance. The music changed to their song, the one that had been playing in O'Malley's bar the day they met. Celeste laid her head on Dorian's shoulder, remembering that angry young man and the desperate woman she'd been. Do you ever miss it, she asked. The old life. Never. That wasn't living. It was just existing. This... He gestured around at their friends, their work, their love. This is real. A young woman approached them, their latest client, a bookkeeper who discovered her company was funding terrorism. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said nervously, "but I just got a call. They're threatening my family." Celeste and Dorian exchanged looks. Without a word, they moved into action. This was their life now, fighting the same corruption that had nearly destroyed them, helping others find the courage to stand up for truth. "Make some calls," Dorian told Marcus. "Get her family somewhere safe." "I'll contact James," Victoria added. "Get the FBI involved." The party shifted seamlessly into a strategy session. Their guests, many of them former whistleblowers themselves, gathered round to help. Celeste looked at her husband, now deep in discussion with their security team. This wasn't the fairy tale ending most girls dreamed of. There was no castle, no perfect peace. Instead, they had purpose, they had truth, and most importantly, they had each other. "Ready to save another life?" Dorian asked, holding out his hand. Celeste took it, feeling her wedding ring, her real one, catch the light. "Always," she said, "together." Because sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about escape to a perfect world. They're about finding someone to fight beside, someone to build a better world with. And that's exactly what they did. One case, one truth, one victory at a time. The beggar and the billionaire. The whistleblower and the rebel. Two people who found each other by accident and stayed together by choice. Their story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now they faced it as they faced everything else. Side by side, hand in hand, hearts beating as one. The end.